Economist here. Gotta put the old block out, just fold it over. YouTube hates the logo, so I try to cover up logos so you can't see anything. Today we're going to be talking about the chaos and uncertainty that keeps being pushed throughout the economy. And now this is for literally to cause fear, uncertainty, and doubt. By creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt within the economy, within the people's perceptions, the powers that be can then control the situation. They can control what it is that you are feeling, what it is that you are believing, and then at the very end of it, literally change the way it is that people are feeling about the economy, feeling about the government themselves. You see these sort of things taking place through dramatic experiences like terrorist attacks, the great financial crisis, COVID, like all the time you find, or every time that you find a major chaotic situation taking place, generally government steps up with like, hey, we got this way of fixing it. It's the problem, reaction, solution, right? There's a problem out there. They're forced to react with a solution. And then that solution usually comes with a major change to the way things are being done. You know, you think about it during like the 9/11 terrorist attacks that happened, almost immediately something called the Patriot Act was launched. Now, the sound of Patriot Act gives it like this idea that it's very freedom loving or something of that nature. It was quite the opposite. More surveillance, more government intrusion into our lives took place after that because of the solution that they needed to the problem that we had experienced, right? The problem of terrorist attack, reaction from the government, solution, more surveillance and intrusion into our lives. So we see these sort of things take place quite often. You know, in fact, you think about it, like the COVID experience within itself. Like a lot of times people look back on that and say, well, we were in this very unusual times, you know, with this major illness coming across the entire globe and, you know, people dying and governments having to react to it like they had no other choice. But then when you step back and you look at that for just a minute and you think, wow, what the government did was absolutely needed to save the central banking system. It was very interesting how it is that a chaotic situation like COVID could actually save the central banking system. And now this is where I think a lot of times people are like, what in the world? No, the government had no other choice. They had to react in this fashion. The unusual and exigent circumstances is what gave the emergency powers needed in order to create the environment to save the central banking system. It was one of the most exquisitely performed tasks that I think could ever have been imagined. Like, and literally it almost seems as if it was built out of imagination. Like, you think about it, how is it that they could have deployed such such a dramatic strategy such as that to combat COVID so quickly, right? The reason why is because they knew what it was that they needed in order to save their own system. And with the unusual and exigent circumstances of COVID, it gave them essentially all the room that they needed in order to perform the tasks that they needed to save that central banking system. Understanding that the Federal Reserve, along with many central banks across the globe, were in a position in which that they had very low neutral interest rates along with low interest rates for their central banking system. Between these two issues, those central banks around the world simultaneously, almost in lockstep, did the exact same thing to save their systems. Stimulus checks, severing of the supply chain. It's weird to think that a self-inflicted wound such as severing the supply chain would actually create an economic environment that benefits the central banking system. Ultimately, it created an inflationary scenario. The inflationary scenario is what benefits the central banking system. Understanding that they were operating at a very low neutral interest rate, low interest rate environment with like the Fed funds rate, this was an ineffective monetary policy. They needed to reverse this. They needed it to be exactly opposite. People had too low of inflation expectation. They needed people with elevated inflation expectation. So now we think about some of the situations that we had faced in the past that actually turned out to be a benefit for the Federal Reserve and the central banking systems, such as that as COVID, such as that as the Great Financial Crisis. When you see how it is that these crisis situations turns out to be what was absolutely needed, the unusual and exigent circumstances, to create the solutions that they needed to solve the problems that we were facing at the time. The Great Financial Crisis had the unusual and exigent circumstances giving the central banking the ability to buy up toxic assets, to go into the quantitative easing, to do the most unorthodox monetary policies that anybody had ever seen. But they knew it was coming. The Federal Reserve was well aware of it. Ben Bernanke did a speech literally 5 years before the Great Financial Crisis describing the Great Financial Crisis, talking about exactly what it is that they were going to do if they could not reverse the deflationary pressures that were building. He talked about asset purchases. He talked about government stimulus. All years before it actually happened. Why? Because they know that there's going to be a problem and that they are going to be forced to react with the solution. The solution is always a change to the way that the government handles the operations. Think about losing your surveillance. Think about how the intrusion into the government or into the banking system that government did during the Great Financial Crisis. Think about all the issues that have come up since COVID and how it is that it's created this government expectations that you are going to have some sort of stimulus into the future in order to have a monetary policy that's going to be effective. Ultimately, people are looking out there and saying, hey, the Federal Reserve needs to follow Donald Trump and listening to him and saying, yes, lower interest rates. People don't seem to understand what that problem that the Federal Reserve would face by lowering interest rates right now. They don't understand that there is no stimulating effect coming from the lowering of the Fed funds rate. If that was the case, then we would have seen stimulus coming from the Great Financial Crisis, where they were operating at the zero lower bound for literally 10 years. Right? It was, I forget exactly the number of days that was operating at the lower bound of zero, but ZERP, zero interest rate policy, had no inflationary pressure that built from it. They failed. They failed miserably. They were looking to get 2% inflation and they couldn't even get there. The Fed and many other central banks around the world were scratching their head going, we're screwed, guys. If we cannot get inflation by operating at the effective lower bound of zero, have historically low unemployment and money printer that caused a balance sheet expansion from 850 billion to over 4.5 trillion, and it failed them. It failed them miserably. They know that they are going to have to constantly be working in crisis. Create the crisis. Just create it. Right? COVID, this tariff, whatever the next one will be after this, problem, reaction, solution. You think about it right now. The idea of tariffs has absolutely disrupted the entire global supply chain and the global economy. Think about what it would take in order to alleviate the pressure. All they have to do is say, oh, there's not as much tariffs. Right? All of a sudden, them not doing something is going to be a stimulating effect. They're like, hey, we were going to do 125%. Now we're backing way off from that. We're going to back away from this 125% or 150% or whatever it was in 90 days, 40 days, whatever it comes down to. They put the credible threat of their tariffs, push it out there in a belief into the people that they have no other choice but to then react to this information. And then once they have reacted to the information, the powers that be can then back off on it and say, oh, we're getting the job done. Oh, it's working for us. Right? Meanwhile, you have changed the way that you are conducting yourself. Literally based on the idea of what it is that's coming into the future with a threat. Or lack thereof, or not a threat, right? The diminishing of the threat. See, I think about what it is that they are doing right now in order to create an inflation expectation that is elevated, because I knew from the very beginning that's what the goal was. I mean, this isn't me imagining it. I didn't imagine that the goal was to have an elevated inflation expectation. I didn't study for years to try and come up with a theory on why it is that they would want an elevated inflation expectation. It came straight from the Federal Reserve's own words when John Williams stated it back in November of 2018, that the problem that they were needing to solve was an inflation expectation that was persistently too low rather than too high. They needed an inflation expectation that is too high, period. They are getting it. People who say that Donald Trump and Jerome Powell are not working together, tell me, do you have an elevated inflation expectation or not? Do you think that the markets have an elevated inflation expectation? Do you believe that nations outside of the United States have an elevated inflation expectation? I mean, outside of China, everybody believes that inflation or hyperinflation or some sort of like dollar destruction idea is going to absolutely destroy the entire global economy. China's the only one suffering in deflation right now. Right? Well, I'm sure there's other nations who probably suffer deflation too, but China's the only one of the major economies that is absolutely experiencing something in which that if they cannot find the inflationary scenario, they are going to find themselves spiraling into the abyss. Okay? China's looking for inflation. United States is looking for inflation. Everybody's working together to try and create fear and uncertainty and doubt. Why? So they can get the inflation. They need it bad. The fiat currency system is dying. I don't know if people realize that. This is how it looks. Their desperate attempt to try and manipulate the beliefs of the people out there, and this is how it looks. This is what it looks like. Yeah, it's not as simple as a lot of people want to make it out to be, right? A lot of people seem to want to like take it at face value, like, you know, what it is that's happening out here, like Trump trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Like, that's even a possible thing. Yeah? Donald Trump wanting to fire Jerome Powell. Like, that's even a possible thing. Yeah? The idea of inflicting, you know, massive tariffs across the entire globe to bring, like, you know, everybody into some sort of submission, is that even a possible thing? Like, all these things, like, I think people have a belief that it could happen, but the reality of the situation is far from that. You're not going to bring manufacturing. You remember onshoring, reshoring? Remember that? That was a big term that was being blasted through the mainstream media. Reshoring. It was all due to bringing manufacturing and supply chains closer to the customer, closer to the market. That's gone, right? Now it's reshoring due to tariffs. And then, like, the whole idea of doing it because of broken supply chains, well, that's, yeah, we don't need to think about that anymore. It's now due to tariffs. Yeah, it's not going to work that way either. Knowing that there is going to be a situation coming into the future in which that the government, the United States, is going to have to desperately manufacture a consumer. That's what's going to happen. Because that's the type of economy that we have built here in the United States, is we are debtor consumers. We're not producer savers. That's the delusional expectation that a lot of people have coming from the administration, that we're going to turn this country into a production-saving nation again. It ain't going to happen without serious pain and misery suffered by the most unfortunate class of people, those at the lowest end, those who earn the least amount of money, those who suffer with job losses. They're going to suffer the most from this experience of trying to reshore, trying to bring manufacturing back. They're the ones who suffer the most from it. The capitalists, the property owners, they're going to experience some pain too. Not nearly the pain that the lower end, the working class, is going to experience. because ultimately they have to have a standard of living that is going to compete against the rest of the world out there. Your standard of living is far too luxurious and far too high to be a manufacturing state. It ain't going to happen. I don't care what delusional belief that anybody puts into this president thinking that he's going to bring manufacturing back to the United States and bring good manufacturing jobs here has no idea about the Cantillon effect. It ain't going to work. It ain't going to work, just the same as it never worked in the past. Never have you had a situation in which that you had an economy that has fallen into luxury, that is going to remove itself from a luxurious experience so that they can be in a productive saving position again in their life. They have too much of a luxurious high standard of living to do that. It ain't going to happen. There is nothing more pleasurable than to increase your standard of living in the luxurious experience that you have, and nothing, absolutely nothing is more painful than to lose that sort of lifestyle. People will cry in pain and suffering and misery. I was listening to a guy yesterday suffering this exact thing. He doesn't understand the Cantillon effect. I'm listening to a guy talk about how painful of an experience he has flipping his new cars around. He's created an experience within himself where he suffers. He suffers because he has new vehicles in his life. He didn't like the first one. He swapped it out for the dually. The dually was too big. He was bumping into stuff with it. He needed to swap that out for another vehicle. He sold one of his other vehicles that he bought because he simply just didn't drive it enough. And I'm thinking, why do you have all these new vehicles, bro? How many could you possibly be driving? What good is it doing you other than making you look good? And now you're complaining that you don't have the $12,000 to pay your taxes with this year. Huh? No kidding. Do you ever think that maybe you didn't have to have that luxurious car, that luxurious truck? Do you think that maybe that's the reason why you're suffering in pain and misery now is because of your luxurious experience? No? No, it's worth it to you, right, to have the luxurious experience so that you can suffer in pain and misery while they take your money from you? Like, this blows me away. This is how most people end up living. And I think to myself, it was just like, yeah, I don't have that kind of experience in my life. I don't get to drive a new truck, but I get to drive this old truck, and I don't have to worry about payments, and I don't have to worry about losing money if I do a trade-in or something of that nature. Like that sort of thing doesn't cross my mind. I don't experience that sort of thing, right? I don't have that luxurious car. I got the luxury of not stressing about making my payments, right? I got the luxury of being able to pay my bills on time because I don't go into luxurious vacations and luxurious experiences and luxurious material possessions. All the people who do that come back and they cry, oh, I can't afford my taxes this year. Government really, raked me over the coals and stuff. And I'm looking out there and I'm like, nice car, bro. Nice car. You know, how much did you make in payments on that thing all year long? About $12,000, didn't you? I said, okay. All right, moving on. You have traffic tickets to worry about, Simon? I don't, Benny. You know this truck don't go that fast. There's a dude I know who has been living in a 20-foot RV and drives a 20-year-old car and isn't married and has no kids, gets like $1,000 a week after taxes. I wonder what his goals are. Who knows, man? But I mean, I know a couple of people who do sleep in their vehicles who have full-time jobs. And I tell you what, these are the same people who I occasionally see them perusing real estate listings. Right? They have a much better dream than beyond just having an apartment or having a decent, way of life right now. They're willing to suffer, be productive, be a saver so that they can move into property ownership going into the future. It's very disciplined and very dedicated to the outcome. Most people won't do that. Don't lie, Simon. You I can't even say the word. Balasinka. I can't even say the word, bro. All right, let's go check out the super chat. We got Jack with $5. How much more time do you think we have till the economy hits a big depression? I don't think we're going to actually experience one. See, the problem with depressions back in the day is they didn't have any real way of stimulating the economy like they do now. If you have a situation in which that you can force feed money into the people to create a consumer. See, this is the thing. The United States does manufacture one major thing, a consumer. We produce consumers. That's the United States. We produce consumers, and if you cannot find a position in which that lowering interest rates sparks the consuming, like if you can lower interest rates and then people go out there and buy houses and cars and go on vacation, then you have a situation in which that you can produce the consumer by lowering interest rates. We are no longer an effective monetary policy to produce a consumer by lowering interest rates. It does not work. Period. End of story. It doesn't work. Most people have no clue. 99% of the people do not realize that. That's a very key component to understanding monetary policy now, is that most people do not get the idea or know or have the understanding that when you lower the Fed funds rate, it will not stimulate the economy because the low neutral interest rate. The neutral interest rate is rising, and there is a lot of evidence out there, especially if you listen to people like Michelle Bowman, who is a voting member of the FOMC, who says that the neutral interest rate is very close to where we are now, referring to the Fed funds rate. But there is no real proof of that because nobody knows exactly where the neutral interest rate is. So the neutral interest rate is somewhere between 0 and the Fed funds rate at where it's at now. Somewhere in there, right? Now, granted, if you go and you listen to a lot of economists, many of them are saying somewhere around 2.5%, even could be a bit higher than that. And Michelle Bowman seems to think that it's close to where the Fed funds rate is now. If you were to lower interest rates today all the way to 0, right, you may be able to get some stimulating effect out of it, right? But it will be the one-shot deal and you will not be able to get it back. The Federal Reserve will have shot their load, right? It will be over. They'll be out of ammunition. It may work. It may work that one time, but then it will absolutely be critical to cause another inflationary scenario into the future for the Federal Reserve to raise the Fed funds rate in order to get the neutral interest rate back off the lower bound of 0, and in order to raise it back up in order to get their ammunition back. That's a very complicated and very difficult thing for a lot of people to internalize, but that is simply the case. The Federal Reserve does not want to waste their ammunition right now. They would much rather use their words to guide the markets and lead the Fed funds rate right where it's at. If you can guide the markets into an elevated inflation expectation and keep that persistent going into the future, right? Tariffs, more credible threats of tariffs, tariffs beyond beliefs, tariffs are not never-ending tariffs, right? You will have an elevated inflation expectation and raise the neutral interest rate. This is how the Federal Reserve is able to acquire their ammunition back. Okay? So now thinking about how it is that the government is going to react to a situation in which that they are not able to stimulate the economy. If the Federal Reserve was to lower interest rates back down to 0, again, they may get their stimulating effect out of it that one time. After that, they will be screwed. I do not believe that they want to waste that. They want to have the credible threat of being able to do it into the future instead, because most people, if you drop interest rates, will not go out there and buy houses and cars and go on vacation because they are simply debt saturated. This dropping of interest rates is not the effective tool, even if they have the room, because of the debt saturated people. They can't go out there and borrow more money to stimulate the economy. However, the government can borrow the money and then force feed it into you in a UBI application or something similar of that nature, stimulus checks. Right? By doing this, now instead of you borrowing the money, the government borrows the money and just hands it to you. Say, here, go become a consumer. Right? And this is what we're falling into. It's simply because it isn't going to work. Like, I mean, it can work this one time because they're essentially getting their ammunition back. But the threat of having the ammunition is a more effective tool than wasting the ammunition on actually dropping rates. The expectation that people have that the Fed could drop rates is more of an effective tool than the actual dropping of rates. Okay? And again, it's hard to internalize a lot of this information, but once you do, once you see it this way, all this stuff clears up. Like all the confusion, the uncertainty, the chaos, the belief that that Trump can fire Jerome Powell or replace the board members or something like that. That's not a real thing. That is not a real thing. It's not even a point to discuss it. The debating of it, the articles, the news coverage of it is literally there to confuse you and to throw you off track, right? To keep you in fear and uncertainty and doubt. That stuff cannot happen, right? There is no way that Jerome Powell can be fired from his position at the Federal Reserve unless he has done something illegal or against the rules. He cannot be fired because Donald Trump doesn't like him, right? That's not the case. That is not how it works. And I don't care how much debating or whatever wants to be discussed over it, it's not going to take place. Right? So for me, it's more about creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt in order to raise the inflation expectation out of the people. When you raise the inflation expectation, you will raise the neutral interest rate. If the neutral interest rate is moving upward and the Fed stands still, the economy becomes less restricted, and it's somewhat of a stimulating effect. I have been saying this over and over and over again, and it's working. It's doing just exactly that. I'm the only one who describes it in this fashion. And I have been saying this for years. This is how I know it's the accurate information. This is how I know it's accurate to what is truly happening out there, because everybody else is changing the strategy on what it is that they believe is happening out there. I am the only one who's consistent over years. Years and years and years. Like, I developed the credible threat theory starting better than 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And the more that I keep looking over the information, the more I study the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, the more I see what's taking place in the economy, the more accurate the credible threat theory becomes. It's the only one that is this consistent. Everybody else has this belief that the Federal Reserve has no idea what they're doing and they're making snap judgment decisions. And I'm thinking to myself, they have no idea on what it is that's going on with monetary policy, and they really do not understand what it is that's taken place within the historical events coming from the Federal Reserve, talking about the Fed funds rate and the neutral interest rate moving close to the zero lower bound. If people are not discussing that within the strategies and what it is that they believe that the Federal Reserve is trying to do right now, if they do not incorporate this fact, right, into their beliefs, then they are going to miss it. You are going to miss what it is that's happening out there. It's because you're going to believe something totally different. You're going to believe that they're doing it to try and fight inflation, that they're doing it because of political reasons. You'll have all these other excuses that come up for them, for the reasons that they're doing this. But the reality of the situation is that they were trying to deal with the fact that they were at the lower bound of zero with a low neutral interest rate. Knowing this as the base of the reasonings that they are doing the things that they are doing today, everything starts to make more sense. Right? It's all about putting the perception into the people, right? Future expectations. That's it. That's the monetary policy nowadays. You notice the Fed doesn't do anything. They really don't do anything, right? Not lately. I mean, they just sat on their hands and like, oh, maybe next meeting, we might do some balance sheet adjustments. Not that anybody understands what that means, But as far as their interest rate adjustments and stuff like that, people have no clue about what's going on with the Fed in the monetary policy. They have no clue. Think about it. Like at the end of 2023, there was people who thought that the Fed was going to go to emergency rate cuts, take them down to zero. Other people believed that there was going to be 7 interest rate cuts coming. I was one of the few people who said at that time, back in 2023, that they might do some symbolic rate cuts to establish the credible threat, but that you're not going to see that much rate adjustments because that's not the monetary policy. The expectations about the interest rate cuts is the monetary policy. The future forward guidance about it. Right? That's what guides monetary policy. All right, Nicholson Letter Bear. Thank you so much for the $9.99. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for being out here. We got 30 minutes into this live stream with 644 people watching. I saw we had it close to almost 700 people. That's amazing. Thank you everybody for joining in on today's live stream. Be sure and hit that like button. By hitting that like button, the YouTube algorithm will grab this video, spread it around for more people to join in. George Gammon had an incredible video on shadow banking and Basel III regs the other day. George Gammon does some serious deep diving into the banking system. Like, I don't know if there's anybody else out there who's not necessarily involved in the financial world itself. Like, I mean, George Gammon obviously is, you know, a huge investor, real estate, and all the other stuff that goes along with it. But as far as somebody who is just kind of studying into what it is that's taking place within the financial system, that guy has such a broad view of everything that's happening out there. It's quite impressive how it is that he's able to understand, you know, understand it to the level that he does. It's quite incredible. But then again, he knows just about everybody in the game, right? You guys whining about things had better save your pennies, because one day soon houses will be 50% off, but only for those who have down payment. Failing to plan is planning to fail. So that's under the belief that there's going to be a freezing up the financial markets, right? Like, if there's going to be some sort of position coming into the future in which that banks are not going to be loaning to people. Now, this is what I feel that the Federal Reserve is probably desperately trying to avoid, is a freezing up of the financial markets. If there is somebody out there who wants to borrow money, the Federal Reserve wants to make sure that there's a loan available for them. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good loan, or that it's like, you know, safe, or, you know, adequate or anything like that, but that it's available, right? That the market is not frozen. That's the critical issue. Like, if there's somebody out there who wants to be able to borrow money to buy a house, the Federal Reserve wants to make sure that the condition in which that there is going to be financing for that house still exists, and that it's not frozen. If there's a crisis and situation in which that the financial market is frozen and people are not able to get the loans, then yes, I would absolutely believe that there is going to be a crash in the housing market. But I don't believe that they are going to allow a situation that would have that sort of event taking place, where you would have like a freezing up of the financial markets. All right. Saving obey during an inflationary period is the same logic storing your food in Grizzly's den. 50% off housing is very unrealistic. Yeah. All right. Okay, guys, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for hanging out. We got, again, 637 people. 650 people just jumped in. 135 likes, $14.99 in super chats. Benny says, okay, Benny, I'm careful. Always got to be careful with Benny's comments. All right. Simon, what are your thoughts on the delinquent student loans being sent to collections come May? It sounds like there's millions just not paying. Benny, I think that, honestly, I think that the asset that the federal, or that the United States government has when it comes to the student loans is a major issue for the government's balance sheet. Like, ultimately, I don't know the exact numbers as of today, but when it comes to the government's balance sheet, not talking about the Federal Reserve, I'm talking about the United States government, right? These are two different entities. A lot of people have a difficult time separating these two. Not the Federal Reserve, but the United States government, their balance sheet, they have assets and liabilities just like everybody else does. Their assets are all the property they own, all the financial assets, all the other stuff, right? The assets that sit on their balance sheet, of those assets, the financial portions of it. Now, I can't tell you how big of the balance sheet that is, but just the financial portion of it. So like all the student loan debts, all the other government bonds that they may hold, the student loan asset-backed securities, right? They're literally called SLABs, SLABS, student loan asset-backed securities. It makes up, and again, I'm not positive on this number, but somewhere around 50% of the financial portion of the balance sheet, of the assets on the balance sheet. That's huge. If you were to take those student loan asset-backed securities and just like remove them from the balance sheet, it would throw the credit rating of the United States absolutely into chaos, right? You got assets and liabilities. The assets, part of that, a good chunk of it, are the student loans. The promise that they are going to get paid for these assets. This is one of the reasons why they make it that you can't bankrupt on them, because if you were to bankrupt on them and make them disappear, it would literally send the United States into a downward credit rating, and their treasuries and stuff like that would become more expensive or become less expensive. What am I trying to say? The yields on them would go up and the prices would come down. The debt cost, the debt burden for the United States would become more expensive in that fashion. So to get rid of, just to eliminate the student loan asset-backed securities, is not a feasible thing without creating a chaotic situation within the credit ratings of the United States itself in the bond market. So to me, like, it makes a lot of sense that they are going to force these people to pay, because you think about it, it's an asset on the government's balance sheet, but what good is that asset if there's no payment coming in? So forcing the people into pay, even going into garnishing wages and stuff like that, or denying them Social Security benefits or something of that nature in order to pay those student loan asset-backed securities, would then give value to those assets, right? But if they're not getting paid, then they essentially don't have any value to them. I don't know. Does all that make sense? Anyway, one more super chat and then I gotta go. Ben, $1.99, thank you so much. You can mine more gold. Bitcoin is absolutely scarce. Okay, sounds like a good investment because you cannot bankrupt out of it. Right, well, if you, as the government, you encourage kids to go and take out a bunch of debt, right? Which, honestly, I look back on that was like really pushed during the Great Financial Crisis. So here they had printed up all this money, but then they need to figure out a way to inject that money into the system. Now you can just like literally hand it over in stimulus checks, or you can get the people to borrow the money. Now, if you're borrowing the money, right, you think about it, most people are buying it to go buy a house, buy a car, go on vacation, buy stuff like that. But even if you're borrowing the money to buy a student loan, right, or you're taking out the money in a student loan to buy the education, you're still borrowing money, right, and injecting that money into the system. So it doesn't really matter how the money gets into the system, so long as it gets into the system, like fill the sluices. And now here you had a situation during the Great Financial Crisis in which that not a lot of people were in a position in which that they could borrow money, but yet you had a whole generation of people who were very much untapped when it came to student loans, and so they just started pushing student loans onto the people. Borrow this money, borrow this money. If you borrow the money, then the money can get into the system. But if you don't borrow the money, then it just sits there in the banks, right? So now you borrow the money, it gets into the system, and oh, sorry guys, I guess all those degrees really don't benefit you any, but at least you benefited the economy by borrowing the money and sending it out there into circulation, essentially. All right? I mean, how do you produce a consumer? How do you produce somebody who is going to borrow the money and spend it? This is the whole thing. That's why government doesn't really like the whole idea of wasteful government spending. Doesn't, when you realize that the reason that happens is because they don't really care where the money goes. They don't. They just don't care. They're like, man, just get it out there. Just start filling the sluices. It doesn't matter so long as it just starts getting out there and chases goods and services. And this is why you find so much like screwed up government, entities, government projects, government, just anything out there that seems wasteful. Take into consideration that they are literally trying to deploy money into the system. And that when you see wasteful government spending, that is probably one of the easiest ways for them to get money out into, like, if you were very concerned about how that money is being used, you were like paying attention, you were very like, strict on how it is that was getting used, then it wouldn't get out there and start chasing goods and services, because people would be very cautious on how it is that they are deploying that money. But if you're just some whacked up, messed up, organization out there that is getting government spending so that you can go and do your wastefulness with it, that is perfectly in line with what it is that the government is looking for in order to deploy money out there. Okay? If you were being very concerned and cautious and keeping that money in the bank, that doesn't work out so well for them. Right? When you look at it this way, all of a sudden it starts making a lot more sense. It's just like, oh, that's why they, have all this wasteful government spending. All right, you guys are awesome, but I have got to go. Uneducated Economist. Benny with the Balenciaga. Is that how you say it? You guys are awesome. Uneducated Economist. You let me know.